history can often be complex, confusing, and if we're being totally honest, rather depressing. And so sometimes you just want to cover something simple and clean. So, let's spin the wheel of history and figure out what it is that we'll be covering today. Alright, so I don't care to catch a break today, so we're going to cover Vietnam. Like most places on this planet, Vietnam is full of deep, interesting history, a complex culture, and fascinating people. But we don't have time for that today. So today we'll be covering the history of Vietnam from about 1850, a little before that, to about 1960s, 70s, right around up to the Vietnam War. This history will give us a pretty good look on the origins of modern-day Vietnam. Vietnam was controlled by China for a very significant portion of its history, until the 1400s when a local rebellion managed to split off from the main superpower. Vietnam's new ruling family called itself the Le Dynasty. Let me apologize, here at the beginning, I can't pronounce these names. Like a significant portion of smaller Asian nations, Vietnam really wouldn't garner the attention of Europe until about the 1500s, but these early European visitors were largely Catholic missionaries and Portuguese sailors. They just shared some trade, but there wasn't much to talk about. The rapid growth in international trade during this time put pressures on Vietnam internally, which paired with already existing pressures from the feudal system caused Vietnam to split itself into two. The northern Trinh and the southern Nguyen. Where have I heard this before? In the late 1700s, the South was nearly destroyed, but the surviving nobility reached out to a Western power for aid, which they got. Where have I heard this before? France answered the call, and together they were able to successfully conquer all of Vietnam by 1802. Okay, at least that one ended differently. Except not by too much, because it wouldn't be long before the new Vietnamese government started becoming super suspicious of their French and European allies. By 1847, Vietnam had harshly persecuted French missionaries and even executed several Catholics. Not wanting to ignore the deaths of their citizens, France responded by bombarding and blockading ports and cities until 1858, when they just decided enough was enough and went ahead with an invasion. Vietnam was now a new colony under French rule. Like all colonies, it suffered from its fair share of horrible problems. Resources stripped and sent to Europe, native religions and customs squashed, indigenous people being forced off their land to make room for new settlers. All of these horrible things are common in colonies, and Vietnam was no exception. Vietnam would remain under this system for the next century or so, with only the occasional minor rebellion to spice things up a little bit, until the 1940s, when Japan decided that they wanted to control the entire Pacific Ocean. And wouldn't you know it, Vietnam was on the Pacific Ocean. So now there's an entirely new group of outside powers occupying the region. It'd be the Japanese occupation of the region that would catch the attention and anger of noted schoolteacher and professional rabble-rouser Ho Chi Minh and his loyal band of communist insurgents. So before we go into what happened next, let's turn back the clock a little bit to figure out how Ho Chi Minh got here. Born Nguyen Sin Kung in 1890, the man who would become Ho Chi Minh was the son of one Nguyen Sinh Hoi, a Vietnamese teacher and minor government functionary who was either fired or resigned in protest because he didn't want to learn French. Sources kind of vary here. Ho Chi Minh, being of relative means, was able to secure a solid education in Vietnam before he headed to Europe while working on a French steamship. He would romp around Western Europe for a while, doing a variety of jobs, though usually some form of teacher or tutor, before he happened upon this fancy new ideology called communism. Ho Chi Minh would take to communism like Jane Fonda to an anti-aircraft gun. The idea of throwing off the ruling class really appealed to him, as he would eventually go on to say, "Dear martyrs, compatriots, this is what we need. This is the path of our liberation." Ho Chi Minh would spend his remaining time in Europe campaigning for various socialist, communist, and anti-colonial reforms. During the Paris Peace Conference following World War I, he sponsored a petition demanding self-determination, and civil rights for the enemies. We know them as the Vietnamese people. He'd also be a founding member of the French Communist Party, so that's fun. In 1924, though, he went to Moscow for further training in the ways of the communists, before he would head to China to push for communism among the Vietnamese exiles there. He did get kicked out for his communist actions, but would come back in 1930 to found the Indochina Communist Party. He would then get arrested by the British in 1939 and held for 2 years before getting kicked out again, but I guess the third time's the charm, because he'd show up again in 1938, but this time with the new Chinese Communist forces working with him. That wouldn't last long because the world was in the process of exploding in this little scuffle called World War II. When Japan took control of Indochina in 1941, Ho Chi Minh saw this as an opportunity and began organizing resistance fighters in the region to take on Imperial Japan. The fighting paid off because eventually Japan surrendered, for reasons, and Japanese forces moved out in 1945. So now Japan was gone and Ho Chi Minh could finally set up his ideal communist homeland. Fortunately for him, it wouldn't be that simple, as France, who was now Hitler-free, found they were really in need of new raw materials for reasons, and wanted to take control of the region again. Ho Chi Minh would respond to French claims on the region with the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. This document would say things like, "For these reasons, we members of the Provisional Government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam solemnly declare to the world that Vietnam has the right to be a free and independent country, and in fact is so already. The entire Vietnamese people are determined to mobilize all their physical and mental strength to sacrifice their lives and property in order to safeguard their independence and liberty." The document would seek to invoke things like the American Declaration of Independence, but it was almost completely ignored, and British and Chinese forces who were supervising the Japanese exit in the region turned Indochina over to France again. Well, Ho Chi Minh wasn't having it, and France needed Vietnam's resources to rebuild, so I guess it's time for war again. In 1946, the First Indochina War would begin in earnest. I want to take this time to address you directly. If this whole time you were thinking that Ho Chi Minh was a valiant, noble freedom fighter, or that France was a peaceful force trying to put down violent insurgents, it's time to divorce yourself of these notions. The First Indochina War is one of the bloodiest and brutalest conflicts in history. Both sides would routinely engage in torture tactics on captured enemy troops. Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh would use a mixture of re-education programs and the tried-and-true methods of coercion and assassination to get people on their sides. France had a habit of firebombing whole villages with everyone's favorite carcinogen, napalm, and didn't care if the villagers were friendly or not. At one point in 1952, the Viet Minh would invade Laos because I guess it was on the way, and when all was said and done, over 500,000 Vietnamese were dead, with estimates varying around 175,000 of them being non-combatants or civilians. The war would rage for around 8 years until the Viet Minh forces launched an attack on the French military headquarters at Dien Bien Fu. They cut the fortress off from resupply and bombarded it for almost 2 months before it surrendered. In total, there were 1,500 dead, 3,000 injured, and over 10,000 French troops taken prisoner. This would be such a crushing loss that France would finally agree to start ending hostilities by any means. The two parties met in Geneva in 1954 to agree to an official ceasefire. The Geneva Accords of 1954 split the country along the 17th parallel. The communist forces went north, and France went south. Hey, it's kind of like that first thing that happened. It was planned that a reunification vote would be held in 1956, but that wouldn't happen for reasons we'll touch on later. So now Vietnam was free from colonial control, and Ho Chi Minh could finally set up his ideal communist homeland. For the second time. Except, what do those accords say again? Vietnam was now effectively split in two, and the two new Vietnams wasted no time setting things up how they wanted. In the north, Ho Chi Minh's forces set up under the uniform government of the Lao Dong. Officially speaking, Ho Chi Minh wasn't a true dictator of the Lao Dong, but instead acted more as a figurehead and ideological sage, spiritual leader almost. The Lao Dong immediately started setting up their communist reforms. All land, businesses, and wealth were seized by the new government. The land reforms would probably be their biggest action. The land that was seized was supposed to be given to the landless peasants, but party conspirators were given first dibs. This was just about the worst time in history to be a landlord. 50,000 of them were executed outright. The rest were all labeled Di Chu, had all their possessions taken away, and were made to perform the most humiliating and degrading jobs in their hometowns. It was essentially illegal to treat the Di Chu with respect, as if you called one sir or ma'am, you could find yourself arrested. Land reforms were also used to wipe away the local identity of people and make them servants of the party. All this was on top of things that were common in a lot of communist nations. Religious persecution was state-sponsored, military might was heavily emphasized, free speech, press, and assembly didn't exist, and of course everyone was to give deference to the omnipresent Lao Dong party. Things weren't significantly different in the South. During the latter parts of the First Indochina War, the United States had been supplying a very significant portion of the French military budget and supplies. Because of this and the U.S. policy of communist containment, the U.S. had a big hand in the selection process for the new South Vietnam government. Fortunately, everyone involved couldn't have picked a worse leader. The Go Dien Diem was chosen as the leader of South Vietnam, and it just couldn't have been worse. Diem was incredibly corrupt. He gave away government positions like breath mints, and all you need to get a cushy position as a high echelon government official was to be related or friends with Diem and his family. Didn't even matter if those were elected positions, by the way, because you can rig those. If you weren't in Diem's pocket, you couldn't go far. Reporters, opposition politicians, and protesters were regularly rounded up under the guise of crushing out communism. Diem was also a devout Catholic and decided that his new nation needed to adopt his religious ideals. The problem with that idea is Vietnam is predominantly Buddhist. This didn't stop Diem from banning many public Buddhist festivals. As a result of Diem's rampant Buddhist hatred, a violent riot broke out in Saigon after a monk lit himself on fire in protest. Martial law had to be declared in order to ring in the violence. To give Diem a little credit, he had to deal with a lot of real enemies in addition to his make-believe ones. North Vietnamese squads were regularly pushing themselves into Southern territory, and in 1954 a small contingent of French loyalists attempted to overthrow the government. Both of these countries would deal with all of these problems on top of a war-torn economy and imminent starvation. Thousands would die in both nations during this time period due to a lack of food and basic necessities. At this point, I've been talking for a pretty long time, and the Vietnam War is next, and it's frankly very depressing, so I'm just going to wrap up here and tackle that at a later date. So what are our big takeaways here? Well, A, if you're France, your nation getting destroyed by the Nazis, probably not a good reason to commit war crimes. B, if you're the communists, maybe don't commit war crimes just because no one's taking your communist utopia ideals super seriously. C, Diem, nepotism is bad governance. And finally, everyone, stop it with the murder all the time. I've been Landon Schoaf. I'm tired. I hate everyone. I hate everything. And frankly, I'm gonna go take a nap.